I can still hear the sound of her ribs breaking. That sharp crack. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the morning like a rifle shot. People say war leaves its scars on the battlefield. They're wrong. Sometimes it finds you again, years later, right in your own driveway. It was supposed to be just another Saturday morning in Brookhaven Hills, Texas, a quiet suburb where the loudest thing you usually heard was a lawnmower or the rattle of a delivery truck. I'd spent 7 years trying to bury the soldier in me after leaving the Navy SEALs. I traded sandstorms and gunfire for trimmed lawns and weekend barbecues. I told myself I'd learned how to breathe again. That morning, the sun poured down in a golden haze, burning off the last of the mist. I was out in the driveway, a sponge in one hand, the hose in the other, washing my old Ford F-150. The water hissed across the silver paint, forming streams that caught the light like liquid glass. For the first time in a long time, I felt almost ordinary. Sarah, my wife of 12 years, stepped out of our SUV wearing that pale blue sundress I loved, soft cotton that moved whenever the breeze picked up. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and the way the sunlight touched it always reminded me of the first morning I saw her smile. She was juggling paper grocery bags, milk, bread, peaches from the farmer's market, and humming an old Patsy Cline tune under her breath. I remember leaning on the hose and just watching her for a moment longer than I should have. There was something peaceful about the way she moved, the way she made even the ordinary seem worth protecting. She caught me staring and laughed as she walked past. "Not helping at all, sailor," she teased. I grinned. "I'm supervising. That's an important job." She shook her head and kept humming, but I saw that tiny crease between her brows, the one that always appeared when something was bothering her. A few minutes later, while she set the grocery bags on the porch to unlock the door, she glanced back at me. "I saw that same gray Malibu again last night," she said. "Slow rolled right past our house around 11. That's the third time this week I set the hose down, the water dripping onto the hot concrete. My eyes did a quick scan of the street, searching for anything out of place before I shrugged. Probably just a delivery driver who got lost. You know these winding streets?" Her brow furrowed deeper. "Ethan, packages keep disappearing on our block. The Willis doorbell camera went dead 2 days ago. Doesn't that sound off to you?" I tried to keep my tone light. "I notice things, hun. If there's a real threat, I'll see it coming. Today's too pretty to borrow trouble." She pressed her lips together and let out a breath that sounded more like a sigh than a laugh. "I just don't like the feeling of being watched." I wanted to tell her I felt it too, the prickling at the back of my neck every time headlights slowed near our driveway. But I swallowed the words. She'd lived through enough sleepless nights back when I was overseas. She deserved a little peace. I turned the hose back on and aimed it at the truck tires, pretending I wasn't already scanning the street the way I used to scan rooftops in Fallujah. Another half hour slipped by in that ordinary suburban rhythm. Water on chrome, the buzz of a lawnmower 2 houses down, the laughter of kids bouncing a basketball on the cul-de-sac. If you'd asked me then, I'd have said it was as close to perfect as life could get. But Sarah's voice tugged me back. She was crouched by the SUV, rearranging the last bag of groceries. "You always think I worry too much," she said quietly. "But one day, you're going to wish you listened." I grinned at her, trying to make it light. "That's why I married you. Someone's got to keep me paranoid." She smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I wish I'd listened harder. I wish I'd let myself believe her instincts instead of clinging to the illusion that we were finally safe. The breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and barbecue charcoal starting up somewhere down the street. I remember thinking how alive everything felt in that moment. The world looked harmless. It wasn't. Somewhere, parked just out of sight behind a stand of oaks, a gray Malibu idled quietly. 2 men sat inside, watching us with the patience of predators. The first rule in the field is to trust your point man's instincts. At home, my point man was Sarah. And that morning, I broke the first rule. They say when you come home from war, you get to leave the fight behind. That's not true. The fight just moves inside your head. Even after 7 years, I still caught myself scanning rooftops, reading the way a stranger's shoulders shifted, listening for the rhythm of footsteps behind me. I'd trained myself to notice what didn't belong. And though I tried to bury those habits under suburban routine, they never stopped humming, quietly, like a low-voltage current running beneath the skin. Sarah knew some of it. She'd lived with the jump in my shoulders every time a car backfired. But there were things I never told her. Nights in Fallujah when we had to move through narrow alleys, never sure if the next corner was safe. The way the air smelled before an IED went off. I didn't want to bring that world into our kitchen over morning coffee. Her own scars were different. Years ago, before we even met, she'd been in a grocery store during a holdup. A kid barely old enough to shave had waved a pistol around, yelling for money, and one of the bullets hit the ceiling light above her. The shower of glass, the sound of people screaming, stayed with her. Even now, a slammed door could make her flinch. Sometimes we joked that between the two of us we made one whole, slightly broken person. Me with the combat reflexes. Her with the quiet bravery of someone who'd survived chaos without training for it. But it wasn't always a joke. There were nights when she'd wake from a dream, breathless, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, counting seconds the way I used to, before a breach, wondering if either of us would ever feel normal again. That Saturday morning was supposed to be proof that we'd made it. The house was ours, the lawn was neat, the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and peaches in paper bags. It felt like the life we'd promised each other, ordinary, safe, a place where the past couldn't reach us. Yet, under that calm, the habit stayed. When I picked up the morning paper, I always glanced over both shoulders. When I took out the trash at night, I'd sweep the streetlights and hedges with my eyes before closing the bin. I thought I was hiding it well, but Sarah noticed. She always noticed. Later, while I was drying the truck's side mirrors, she stepped out again to water the hanging ferns. She said, without looking at me, "You still don't sleep right. I hear you up at 2, walking around." I tried to play it off with a shrug. "Just restless. Comes with age." She gave me that look, half patient, half unconvinced. "You think you're protecting me by pretending you're okay. But sometimes I feel like you're still out there, waiting for something to go wrong." I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to tell her that she wasn't wrong. A soldier's ears never stop listening for trouble. I wanted her to believe I'd laid it down, even when I hadn't. She changed the subject before I had to find the words. "You know," she said softly, "after that kid with the gun at the store, I told myself I'd never freeze again. But I hate that I still jump when I hear a bang. It makes me feel weak." I put the rag down and stepped closer, touching her arm lightly. "You're not weak?" "You kept standing. That's stronger than you think." She smiled then, small but real. In that moment, I felt the distance between us shrink, as if the ghosts of our pasts stepped back into the shadows for a while. We didn't know that only a few hours later, those shadows would walk right up our driveway. The warning signs were there. Vanishing packages, a dead doorbell camera, the same car circling the block at night. We saw the pieces, but we didn't fit them together. Not until it was too late. We thought the worst was behind us. But the neighborhood had been trying to tell us otherwise for weeks. We just didn't listen closely enough. It started small. Little things neighbors complained about during morning walks. Packages went missing off porches. At first, everyone blamed delivery drivers. Then the Willis family's brand new doorbell camera stopped working overnight, as if someone had yanked the wires out. 2 streets over, a set of lawn tools disappeared from a shed. I chalked it up to petty theft. Teenagers, maybe. But Sarah, she felt something meaner moving under the surface. One night, about a week before that Saturday, I'd gone out to take the trash to the curb. The moon was bright enough to paint the hedges silver, and I caught sight of a gray Malibu creeping around the corner, its headlights dimmed. It slowed near our driveway, just for a heartbeat, then rolled on. I stayed there holding the trash can lid longer than I needed to, listening to the car fade away. When I went back inside, Sarah was watching me from the kitchen window. The next morning over coffee, she said quietly, "That's the same car I saw last night around 11. It stopped in front of the Petersons' house, then pulled away when I looked out. I told her it was probably nothing, but I didn't tell her that I'd already memorized the shape of the car's taillights. The days leading up to the attack carried that kind of uneasy calm, the sort you feel in the desert right before the wind shifts. I noticed small things, the same cigarette butt left near our mailbox 2 mornings in a row, footprints in the damp soil by the side gate that didn't match my boots or Sarah's sneakers. I even found the latch on the back fence half unhooked one afternoon. I fixed it and said nothing. Old habits die hard, but so does denial. Sarah's unease grew more visible. She started double-checking the locks before bed, something I used to do without her knowing. She kept glancing at the street whenever a car drove by, slower than usual. I could feel her worry pressing against the calm I was trying to hold on to. One evening, 3 days before everything happened, we were sitting on the porch swing watching the sky turn red over the rooftops. She leaned her shoulder against mine and said, almost in a whisper, "Something's coming, Ethan. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel like just kids stealing packages." I remember forcing a chuckle. "You've been watching too many crime shows." But even as I teased her, my eyes followed a delivery van until it disappeared down the block, making sure it didn't slow where it shouldn't. That was the truth of it. My instincts were already awake, pacing like a caged dog, but I kept them on a leash. A day later, I passed by the community bulletin board near the park and noticed a new flyer, half torn by the wind. It warned residents about imposters posing as utility or HOA inspectors. No one had signed it. I meant to mention it to Sarah, but forgot. Or maybe I didn't want to give her another reason to worry. Looking back, all those small signs line up in my mind like red flags on a map. At the time, they were just noise scattered across ordinary days, nothing urgent enough to push me into action. On the Friday night before that Saturday, I was in the garage tightening a loose hinge on the gun safe when I heard the crunch of gravel outside. By the time I stepped to the door, the sound had gone. The street was empty under the porch lights, but the air felt heavier somehow. Sarah asked later why I was so quiet at dinner. I told her I was tired. The truth was I kept replaying that slow-rolling gray car in my head, wondering why a man like me still needed a reason to trust his own instincts. The signs were all there, packages gone, cameras dead, a car that circled like a shark in shallow water. We just didn't know whose hand was on the wheel, or how close it already was. I didn't know it at the time, but while Sarah and I were busy second-guessing shadows on the street, someone was busy turning those shadows into a plan. His name was Richard Kane. On paper, he was the president of the Brookhaven Hills Homeowners Association. Slick suits, polished smile, the kind of man who shook every hand at the block party. In truth, he was a real estate shark who'd made a habit of buying up homes at half their worth, usually after scaring the owners into selling. I only learned this later from a detective's file, but the story still makes my stomach tighten. Kane had been eyeing our street for months. He wanted to bulldoze a row of older homes, including ours, to make room for a set of high-end townhouses. We weren't interested in selling, and neither were a few other families. That's when Kane turned to muscle. He reached out to Troy Maddox, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a history of working security at strip malls until he got fired for roughing up a teenager. Troy brought along his old drinking buddy, Cal Rivers, shorter, solid as a brick wall, the kind of man who liked his sleeves rolled high to show off a faded snake tattoo curling around his wrist. Both had records just clean enough to avoid notice, but dirty enough for the job Kane wanted done. The plan was simple. Use fear. Pose as HOA enforcement officers, start with citations and threats, then escalate to accidents. Broken fences, stolen mail, smashed cameras. Anything that made a family feel unsafe in their own yard. Once the pressure built high enough, Kane would appear at the door with a generous-sounding offer to buy the house and relieve the homeowners of their trouble. Neighbors on the far end of the block had already folded. I remember the Johnsons packing up one weekend with barely a word, claiming they'd found a better school district. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now I know they were scared out. Later, I'd also learned that 2 other families were quietly offered small envelopes of cash each month, just to mind their own business. That explained the averted eyes, the quick nods, the doors that shut a little too fast whenever Troy's beat-up Chevy Malibu rolled past. Kane never came near us himself. Men like him don't dirty their hands. Instead, he let Troy and Cal do the late-night cruising, the intimidation, the break-ins that never quite left enough evidence for the police. From the outside, it looked like random petty crime. Inside the scheme, it was a slow siege. Sarah's instincts had been right all along. She'd felt that shift in the air before either of us could name it. I hate admitting that I brushed it aside. The detective's report later described a meeting that made my skin crawl just reading it. A week before the attack, Kane met Troy at a roadside bar 2 towns over. The place smelled of stale beer and fried onions, lit by a row of tired neon signs. The report noted that Troy remembered the way Kane's polished cufflinks glinted under the dim bar lights as he pushed the envelope forward, his face half hidden in the amber glow. That's how business was sealed, over cheap whiskey and the quiet slide of cash across a sticky wooden table. By the time I was tightening the gun-safe hinge in my garage that Friday night, their deal had already been struck. One more incident, Kane had said. Something to finally shake the coals enough to consider moving. We were next on their list. We just didn't know it. By the time the sun rose that Saturday, the trap had already been set. All it needed was the right moment, and the right victim to step into it. Saturday morning should have stayed ordinary. The sunlight was still soft enough to throw long shadows across the cul-de-sac, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass mixed with something sweet drifting from a neighbor's grill. I remember thinking that if peace had a sound, it would be the hiss of water sliding off the hood of my truck. Sarah was on her second trip from the SUV to the porch, balancing 2 grocery bags against her hip. The light blue sundress she wore brushed the tops of her knees as the breeze tugged at it. I was still rinsing the soap suds off the truck tires, half watching her, half lost in the simple rhythm of water on metal. The first sign that something was wrong came as a shadow stretching across the edge of the driveway. I looked up, expecting to see a jogger passing by. Instead, 2 men were approaching from the sidewalk. The one in front was tall with a thick beard, wearing a faded orange safety vest over a dark t-shirt. The other was stockier, sleeves rolled high to show a smear of old ink around his wrist, a snake or something like it. Both wore cheap sunglasses that hid their eyes, and the way they moved, slow, purposeful, set off a low hum in the back of my mind. I thought they might be delivery guys at first, until the bearded one raised a plastic badge clipped to his vest, the kind you'd get from a discount print shop. His voice was sharper than the morning deserved. "Ma'am, you're in violation of HOA regulations." Sarah stopped short, shifting the bags higher on her hip. Her brows drew together as she answered, steady but polite. "There's no HOA on this street." For half a second, there was only the buzz of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Then the man stepped closer, and something in his face changed, like a mask slipping. "Multiple complaints," he said. "Unauthorized vehicles, trash violations, unapproved landscaping. We'll have to issue a fine." I could hear the edge in his tone even from where I stood. Sarah's voice stayed calm, but I saw her tighten her grip on the grocery bag. "I think you got the wrong address." The shorter man, the one with the tattoo, lingered a step behind, flipping through a clipboard with exaggerated importance. His eyes kept scanning our porch, the garage, the open side gate, as if he were making an inventory of things that didn't belong to him. I shut off the hose, but didn't move yet. There's a rule you learn early in combat. Don't escalate until you know what you're dealing with. From where I stood, they could still be bluffing, just a pair of grifters looking for a mark. But something about the way the bearded one squared his shoulders made me take a step forward. Sarah shifted back half a step herself, the rear bumper of the SUV brushing against her hip. "I told you," she said again, more firmly this time. "We don't have an HOA here." That was when he reached for her. His hand shot out quick, fingers closing around her upper arm. "Hey!" Sarah's gasp cut through the quiet. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. It happened fast after that. One of the grocery bags slipped from her grasp, crashing to the driveway. Milk and peaches tumbling across the concrete. The man shoved her back, just a single hard push. But it was enough. I saw her foot catch the edge of the curb. She went down hard, a twist of blue fabric and dark hair hitting the pavement. The sound that followed, the crack of bone against concrete, was a sound I'd never forget. It was soft, almost delicate, but it froze the air around me. For an instant I couldn't move. The scene felt unreal, the sunlight flashing off broken glass from the milk bottle, the hiss of water still dripping from the hose I'd dropped, Sarah's breath coming out in a sharp, ragged gasp as she tried to sit up and couldn't. The stocky man crouched beside her fallen purse, sifting through it as if rifling a stranger's belongings was part of his morning routine. The bearded one stood over her, arms folded, watching the street with the casual stance of a man waiting for a bus. Neither of them looked remotely concerned that they'd just hurt someone. I started forward then, slow at first, my boots squelching in the puddle forming under the truck. Every step I took tightened something inside me, like a rope winding around a post. Sarah tried to rise on one elbow and failed, her hand clutching at her side. I heard her draw in a shallow breath that sounded like it sliced her from the inside. The taller man finally noticed me closing in. His head turned slightly, and for a fraction of a second, I saw surprise flicker in his eyes. Surprise at the man walking toward him without a hint of hesitation. He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything shifted. I wasn't hearing the lawnmower anymore, or the laughter of kids down the street. All I could hear was Sarah's broken breath and the pulse in my ears as I closed the distance between us. The moment her foot slid off the curb felt slower than real time, as if the air itself thickened around us. Sarah's hands shot out, trying to steady the falling bag, but the weight of it pulled her sideways. The shove from the bearded man wasn't wild or frantic. It was practiced, just a flat palm push at the shoulder meant to move her aside. That made it worse somehow. No anger, no panic, just a man doing something ugly with no more thought than tossing an empty can. She stumbled backward into the SUV's rear bumper. I heard the thud of her hip against the metal before her heel caught the edge of the curb. A single sharp cry left her throat. Then came the sound that has never left my ears. The hollow crack of bone striking concrete, followed by the hard gasp as the air was punched out of her chest. I dropped the hose without realizing it. Water spilled from the nozzle, forming a thin stream that crawled down the driveway and pooled near my boots. Every muscle in my body locked in place for a heartbeat, as if waiting for permission to move. Sarah lay twisted near the curb, one arm clutched protectively across her ribs, her dark hair spilling over her face. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts that sounded wrong, too shallow, too painful. When she tried to shift her weight, a flash of anguish crossed her face, and she froze, as though even breathing threatened to splinter her further. The stocky man crouched by her fallen purse. He was calm, almost bored, sorting through her things, wallet, keys, phone. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the phone aside. It skidded across the concrete and landed near the storm drain with a dull splash. The bearded one, Troy, though I didn't know his name yet, stood with his arms crossed, scanning the street with the casual posture of a man waiting for a bus. It was as if hurting her had been part of the job description. I started forward, slow at first, boots splashing in the puddle left by the hose. Each step wound the coil of something deep in my chest tighter, a pressure that felt both hot and cold. "Back off!" Troy barked, but there was no conviction behind it, more a reflex than a threat. Sarah tried again to push herself upright on one elbow, but her body betrayed her. She let out a sharp cry, curling forward protectively over her side, before collapsing back onto the concrete. I saw her fingers dig into her dress near the ribs, her knuckles white. In that instant, the world around me went quiet. The hum of the lawnmower 2 houses down faded. The shouts of kids playing basketball dissolved into the background. There was only the hiss of the water trickling down the driveway and the drumbeat of my own pulse in my ears. I closed the distance in a few strides. The man with the clipboard, Cal, shifted slightly, straightening as if gauging whether he should block me. His eyes met mine for a brief moment and then darted to my hands, maybe realizing too late that I wasn't stopping. Troy finally turned to face me fully. For the first time, I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his expression, like a predator realizing the prey might have teeth. I didn't speak. Words weren't going to fix what they'd already done. From where I stood, I could hear Sarah's uneven breathing, each inhale sounding like it cost her more than she had to give. That sound cut through me deeper than any shout or threat could have. Combat training has a way of erasing the middle ground. One moment you're measuring distance, the next you're moving. I stepped in, closing the gap with Troy until I was near enough to see the coarse grain of his beard, the vein pulsing faintly at his temple. He moved to raise his arm, whether to shove or strike I never found out, because my body reacted before my thoughts caught up. A pivot on the heel, a shift of weight, a snap of hips. The maneuver was second nature, muscle memory from 100 drills. A clean hip throw. Troy's feet left the ground. His back hit the driveway with a hard, muffled grunt that rattled through the concrete. The clipboard clattered away, papers fanning out across the wet pavement. I planted myself between Sarah and the second man, shoulders squared, my stance balanced without even thinking about it. Cal froze where he stood, eyes flicking from me to the scattered groceries to Sarah on the ground. Then his right hand moved toward his belt, and the brief glint of sunlight off a blade told me everything I needed to know. There was a fraction of a second when instinct screamed at me to close the distance and disarm him, but Sarah was behind me, injured, unable to move. If he lunged past me, she had nowhere to go. That single fact pinned my feet in place. I needed a weapon. I let my gaze sweep the yard, cataloging possibilities. The hose, useless; the scattered gravel, too far; the truck, too far. And then I remembered the porch, the hidden safe behind the panel, 3 long strides from where I stood. Cal's lips curled into the start of a grin, as if he sensed the calculation in my eyes. He shifted his stance, knife angled low, preparing to spring. That was when a sudden hiss split the air. Sarah's trembling hand shot out from where she sat against the SUV. I hadn't even realized she still had her purse close by. From it, she pulled a small pepper spray canister, a habit she'd kept ever since that grocery store holdup years ago. The mist caught Cal full in the face before he could react. He jerked back with a guttural shout, stumbling a step as his free hand shot up to shield his eyes. The knife wavered in his grip, his smirk vanishing under a grimace of pain. Even hurt and struggling to breathe, Sarah had given me a few precious seconds. Seconds I couldn't afford to waste. My legs coiled, ready to launch toward the porch. Every heartbeat counted, every breath timed to the second. I was done being the man who hesitated. The moment I chose to run for the porch, the world shrank to a narrow tunnel, just the 3 strides between me and the safe. Every muscle in my legs coiled like steel cables, ready to fire. Behind me, Sarah let out another breathless whimper. It sliced through the noise like a signal flare, pushing me harder. Cal's shoes scraped against the concrete. That sound alone told me he'd shifted his weight forward, predator moving in. I didn't dare glance back. I kept my focus straight ahead. The porch steps felt miles away, though they were only a few yards. Sunlight flashed off the wet driveway as I launched forward. I could hear the slap of my boots, the sharp rasp of my own breath, the faint rattle of the porch screen door in the breeze. Combat training never really leaves you. Even after 7 years of civilian life, the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. You move, you scan, you calculate without needing words. Step 1, close the distance. Step 2, secure the weapon. Step 3, eliminate the threat before it reaches the injured. I hit the porch in 3 pounding strides. My fingers, slick with sweat and water from the hose, fumbled for only a heartbeat before finding the hidden latch on the wooden panel near the doorframe. A quick twist and the panel popped open with a soft mechanical click, a sound so familiar it felt like muscle memory. Inside the narrow safe, my old M4 carbine rested in its cradle, clean and oiled, as if it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. I grabbed the grip with my right hand, feeling the cool, textured metal bite into my palm. It was a weight I knew, a balance that steadied my heartbeat. The moment the stock found the pocket of my shoulder, everything else, the panic, the noise, fell into line. Breathing slowed, vision sharpened. It felt almost obscene how natural it was to hold that rifle again. A quick thumb flicked the safety to fire. The iron sights rose to my eye as smoothly as a handshake with an old friend. I pivoted off the porch to face the driveway. Troy was back on his feet now, shaking off the throw, still unsteady but angrier. Cal was stumbling near the SUV, cursing and clawing at his face, the knife hanging uselessly in his hand. For a heartbeat, all 3 of us froze, like pieces on a chessboard waiting for the next move. My voice came out low but steady, a tone I hadn't used in years. "Step away from her." Cal hesitated, his body language screaming pain, not aggression. Troy shot a panicked glance at his partner, then back at the muzzle of my rifle. I could read the calculation on his face, fight or run. Troy muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch, then jerked his head toward the car. It was a silent order, retreat. For a moment it looked like they'd bolt without another word, but Cal's pride slowed him down. He took one last step backward, still holding the knife as if unwilling to admit defeat. I didn't fire, not yet. I kept the rifle trained, letting the calm in my stance say what words couldn't. Take one wrong step, and this ends. That was the first moment since Sarah's fall that I felt in control again. Not calm, but centered. The M4 wasn't just a weapon. It was a line in the sand. When they finally turned and began retreating toward the Malibu, my breathing stayed slow and even, but I tracked every move they made. One wrong twitch, one glance back with that knife raised, and I was ready to close the gap with a trigger pull. The warm Texas morning seemed to hold its breath with me. Even the neighbor's lawnmower had gone quiet, leaving only the soft hiss of the hose water pooling near Sarah's feet. I didn't plan to shoot, I planned to let them leave. But the way they moved, the hurried slam of the car doors, the rev of that battered Malibu told me the fight wasn't over yet. The next 6 seconds would prove it. The moment my boots hit the porch, I felt the shift inside me, the calm before the trigger pull, the tunnel vision that only comes when you know the next breath might change everything. Behind me, Cal was still staggering, one hand clawing at his burning eyes, the other groping for the knife. Sarah's pepper spray still hung in the warm morning air, a faint, bitter scent carried by the breeze. That single burst of courage from her had bought me just enough time. My wet fingers slipped for a heartbeat on the latch, then found their grip. The hidden panel swung open with a quiet mechanical click that felt almost like the turn of a lock on memory itself. Inside, the M4 carbine lay cradled in its mount, black metal glinting faintly in the sunlight that filtered through the porch slats. The moment I wrapped my hand around the grip, the weight settled into my palm like an old promise. I swung it free, shouldered it in one smooth motion, my thumb flipping the safety off as naturally as drawing a breath. The stock tucked against me, the sights rising to my eye, my heartbeat slowed to a steady, deliberate rhythm. I stepped off the porch, scanning over the iron sights. Down the driveway, Troy had helped Cal stumble toward the gray Chevy Malibu, parked half on the curb, engine still idling with a low, uneven growl. Troy yanked open the driver's side door with a curse while Cal wiped at his face, blinking hard against the sting of the spray. From where I stood, maybe 20 yards out, I could see the panic in the way Troy fumbled the keys, the hurried slam of the car door. Their retreat wasn't surrender. It was the frantic scramble of men trying to cut their losses and vanish. I advanced a few steps down the driveway, boots leaving wet prints on the concrete. I raised my voice, calm, measured, the tone I'd once used to order a suspect to stand down. Stop the car. Step out. Hands where I can see them. For half a second, I thought they might listen. Then the Malibu's engine roared louder, exhaust coughing black smoke as Troy jammed the gear into reverse. The car lurched backward, tires squealing as he spun the wheel to angle toward the street. That was the moment training replaced hesitation. In a combat zone, you don't wait for a threat to circle back. You end the threat before it can regroup. I inhaled once, held it, felt the rifle stock settle deeper into my shoulder. Through the sights, the car's front fender lined up in crisp focus. My finger found the trigger. Pop. The first shot cracked through the morning like a hammer striking sheet metal. The round punched cleanly into the front fender, jerking the car sideways with a shudder that rattled the hood. Pop. The second shot shattered the passenger side mirror, shards of glass bursting outward like a spray of glitter caught in the sun. Pop! The third hit the hood near the grill, an angry metallic thud followed by a thin hiss of steam from the punctured radiator. Pop! The fourth blew out the front tire. The car jerked violently left, nose dipping toward the curb as rubber shredded against asphalt, the screech sharp enough to make nearby dogs start barking. Pop! The fifth round spiderwebbed the rear windshield, scattering glass inward over the torn fabric of the back seat. Pop. The sixth and final shot drove through the trunk lid, punching a neat black hole through the dented metal before slamming into the spare tire inside. 6 rounds, 6 seconds. Then silence, broken only by the hiss of the punctured radiator and the slow creak of the car as it lurched to a stop, half spun across the street like a wounded animal. A faint curl of smoke rose from the shredded front tire. The smell of burnt rubber mingled with the coppery tang of hot metal in the warm air. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. The street felt frozen, as if even the sunlight had paused. Then the driver's side door of the Malibu slammed open and Troy tumbled out, stumbling to his knees with both hands raised high. Cal followed a second later, coughing, eyes red and wet from both the pepper spray and panic. They backed away from the crippled car, palms spread toward me, their voices cracking with frantic shouts that they were done, that they gave up. I didn't lower the rifle. I kept the sights trained on them, breathing slow, my voice level when I finally spoke. On the ground, face down. Now, they obeyed without argument, dropping flat on the asphalt, fingers laced behind their heads. All the swagger was gone. Whatever bravado they had arrived with had drained out in those 6 seconds. Only then did I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I lowered the muzzle a fraction, but didn't switch the safety back on yet. The weight of the M4 still felt steady in my hands, and I wasn't ready to give up that edge. Behind me, I heard Sarah draw in a shallow breath that sounded less ragged than before, but still painful. I turned my head just enough to check on her. She was sitting up slightly now, leaning against the SUV, her face pale, but her eyes locked on me. The pepper spray canister still dangled loosely from her fingers like a spent flare. A ripple of movement at the edge of the street caught my attention. Neighbors peeking out from porches and driveways, some holding up their phones to record. A child's bicycle lay toppled on a lawn across the road, where its rider had abandoned it and run inside. Somewhere in the distance came the faint rise of sirens, that high, wavering sound threading its way through the summer heat. I finally flipped the safety back on and lowered the rifle until the stock rested lightly against my hip. But I stayed near the edge of the driveway, still between Sarah and the 2 men on the ground. The street that had been quiet only minutes before was now scattered with broken glass, tire smoke, and the smell of spent gunpowder. I knew the fight was over for the moment, but the sirens told me the next round of questions was already on its way. The quiet that followed the shooting was heavier than the noise that had come before it. The hiss of the Malibu's punctured radiator, the soft creak of its bent fender, even the faint drip of water from my hose. All those small sounds seemed suddenly too loud, as if the street itself didn't know what to do with the silence. Troy and Cal lay face down on the asphalt where I had ordered them, hands clasped behind their heads, their breaths coming in harsh, uneven bursts. The swagger they'd carried onto my driveway had bled out of them along with their nerve. Neither dared to move. Behind me, Sarah shifted slightly against the SUV, wincing as she did. Her sundress was smeared with a faint dusting of concrete and dirt. She held the pepper spray can loosely in her lap, like she wasn't quite sure when she'd grabbed it. When her eyes met mine, there was no panic there, just pain and a fierce steadiness that made my chest tighten. I kept the rifle lowered but ready, standing where I was, watching the 2 men on the pavement while my ears tracked the distant rise of sirens. The sound came in waves, echoing off the houses, growing clearer with each passing second. A screen door creaked open nearby. Mrs. Hollis from across the street stepped out onto her porch, one hand over her mouth, the other clutching her phone. She didn't say a word, just stared at the scene. 2 men lying on the ground, a car riddled with bullet holes, Sarah leaning pale against the SUV, and me with the M4 still in my hands. A moment later, other neighbors followed, some in slippers, others already holding their phones up to film, their faces pale with a mixture of shock and curiosity. I heard a child crying somewhere down the block, followed by the soft slam of a door as someone ushered them back inside. The warm scent of barbecue that had drifted earlier now mingled with the acrid smell of burnt rubber and hot metal. The first patrol car swung into the cul-de-sac, with its siren dropping to a low wail as it slowed. Blue and red lights flashed across the houses, bouncing off wet concrete and shattered glass. Another cruiser followed close behind, then an ambulance. 2 officers stepped out of the lead car, weapons drawn but not raised. Their eyes swept the scene fast. At me, at the rifle, at the 2 prone men on the pavement. I raised my free hand to shoulder level, fingers spread, keeping my voice calm but loud enough to carry. Rifles on safe. I'm the homeowner. They attacked my wife. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair, and the no-nonsense tone of someone who'd seen too many calls like this, nodded once. Keep it where it is. We've got them. He gestured for his partner to cuff Troy and Cal. The 2 men didn't resist. If anything, they looked almost grateful to be taken in, as if the fight had been drained out of them entirely. Another pair of officers moved to check on Sarah. I stayed close as the paramedics knelt beside her, speaking gently while assessing her ribs. The way she sucked in her breath at their touch told me more than any X-ray could. As they eased her onto a stretcher, she caught my sleeve with her free hand and whispered hoarsely, "I'm okay. Stay calm." I nodded, even though the calm she asked for felt a mile out of reach. One of the younger officers glanced at the rifle leaning against my hip, then at the bullet-scarred Malibu smoking at the curb. There was no accusation in his eyes, only the kind of understanding you see from someone who's had to make a hard call before. Neighbors gathered in small clusters at the ends of their driveways, whispering. Some nodded to me when our eyes met, small, wordless gestures that said more than any thanks could. The officer with the gray-flecked hair approached again, this time with a softer expression. "You'll need to give a statement," he said quietly. "But from what I see here, you did what you had to do." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and finally lowered the rifle completely, resting the stock gently against the porch post. For the first time since Sarah hit the ground, my hands were empty. The sirens faded into the background hum of the street, leaving behind the flash of lights and the low murmur of voices. The fight was over, but the questions, the legal kind, were only just beginning. They kept me at the scene for almost 2 hours after the ambulance pulled away with Sarah. The red and blue lights still washed over the houses like restless waves, even as the sun climbed higher, bleaching the street in hard daylight. A young officer with a clipboard took my statement first. His questions were polite but exact: time of the first contact, number of shots fired, whether I'd warned the suspects before pulling the trigger. I answered as evenly as I could, sticking to the facts: 2 men posing as HOA, physical assault on my wife, threat with a knife, my retrieval of the rifle, 6 controlled rounds aimed to disable the vehicle. Then the senior officer, the one with the gray in his hair, stepped over. He had already spoken to a few neighbors who had witnessed the entire scene. His questions were shorter, the kind that cut straight to the core. "Any shots fired at the men directly?" "No, sir. All at the vehicle." His gaze met mine for a moment, steady, as if measuring the truth in my voice. Finally, he gave a short nod and moved on. Before heading to the station, I called a number an old Navy buddy had given me, a former JAG officer turned defense attorney named Mark Halpern. He picked up on the second ring, his voice crisp, calm, the way lawyers sound when they've heard every kind of trouble before. I laid out the basics: the assault, the gun, the 6 shots. Halpern didn't waste words. He just said, "Texas Castle Doctrine's on your side. Keep your answers short, stick to the facts, and don't guess at anything you can't prove." His advice steadied me more than I expected. By late afternoon, I was at the station to file a full written statement. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and paper, dry, bureaucratic, the kind of place where even heroics felt reduced to ink on forms. I sat across from a detective who introduced himself as Detective Holloway. Thin frame, calm voice, the kind of man who gave the impression that nothing surprised him anymore. He slid a recorder across the table. "Tell it in your own words. From the first time you noticed them to the last shot fired." So I did. I spoke about the missing packages, the gray Malibu, Sarah's unease, the moment she was shoved, and the sound of her ribs breaking. I described how Cal reached for the knife, how I ran for the porch, how Sarah's pepper spray gave me those few seconds, and how I aimed for the car to stop them from escaping. Holloway didn't interrupt once, just made small notes on a legal pad, the pen scratching quietly over the paper. When I finished, he clicked the recorder off and leaned back in his chair. "Castle Doctrine's pretty clear in Texas," he said. "You were on your own property. They initiated the assault. You didn't fire on them directly. You'll have to wait for the DA's review, but I don't see charges sticking." I nodded, feeling a small measure of relief. His words lined up exactly with what Halpern had told me on the phone an hour earlier. That consistency helped me believe I might walk out of this without the law turning against me. He wasn't wrong. By evening, the local news had already run a headline: "Homeowner uses rifle to stop HOA imposters, 6 shots in 6 seconds." Clips filmed by neighbors were all over social media. Grainy phone footage of the Malibu jerking sideways under gunfire, Sarah being loaded into the ambulance, my figure standing in the driveway with the M4 at my side. Some comments called me a hero. Others accused me of overreacting, of turning the street into a shooting range. The internet was having its usual trial by outrage. I tried to ignore the noise, but it seeped in through every message and call from friends and relatives who'd seen the clips online. Each conversation felt like I was defending myself in a courtroom that had no walls. That night, the house felt too quiet. Sarah was in the hospital, under observation for her ribs, leaving the rooms hollow. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, the glow of my phone screen lighting my face as I scrolled through the news coverage. I should have turned it off, but part of me needed to know how the world was judging me. Around midnight, I got a call from Detective Holloway. They'd searched the Malibu and found a stash of stolen mail, counterfeit HOA badges, and a small handgun hidden in a ripped canvas bag beneath the driver's seat. "Good for your case," he said. "Bad for them." I thanked him, though the words felt thin. Proof of their crimes didn't erase the image of Sarah gasping for air on the driveway. Over the next few days, the story refused to die down. A talk show host debated whether I'd been reckless. A retired cop on another station defended my actions, pointing to the castle doctrine and the evidence recovered from the suspect's car. Meanwhile, neighbors dropped by with casseroles and quiet nods of respect. Others crossed the street rather than meet my eyes. I'd faced enemies overseas, but I'd never felt the weight of judgment like I did sitting in my own home, waiting to find out if the law would see what I'd done as protection or aggression. When the DA's office finally called, I felt my chest tighten as if bracing for another firefight. But what came next wasn't a battle. It was the verdict that would decide whether I could finally breathe again. The Travis County Courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, an aroma I'd always associated with libraries, not with judgment. I hadn't been in a courtroom since my Navy days when I'd testified as a witness in a JAG inquiry. This was different. This time, I was the one sitting at the defendant's table, waiting to hear whether the law saw me as a protector or as a man who went too far. Mark Halpern, my attorney, sat beside me. He was calm in that unshakable way some people carry from the service into civilian life, shoulders squared, suit pressed, voice low and steady. "Remember," he'd said before we walked in, "let me do the talking unless the judge asks you directly. We don't need to win hearts. We need to hold the law." Sarah sat a few rows behind us, her ribs still wrapped under her blouse, her face pale but determined. The sight of her sitting upright, despite the pain I knew she carried, steadied me more than any deep breath could. The DA's team opened with a sober tone, acknowledging the castle doctrine, but questioning whether my choice to fire at the Malibu had been proportionate. A junior prosecutor tried to paint a picture of me as a trained Navy SEAL who could have subdued the men without a firearm. I felt the stir of frustration in my chest, but Halpern's subtle shake of the head kept me silent. When it was Halpern's turn, his delivery was as precise as a well-planned operation. He walked the jury through the timeline: the assault on Sarah, the visible knife, the pepper spray, the suspect's attempt to flee in the vehicle. He displayed photos of the evidence recovered from the Malibu: stolen mail, counterfeit HOA badges, burglary tools, the handgun under the seat. Finally, he played a muted phone video captured by a neighbor, showing Sarah on the driveway clutching her side as the Malibu jerked into gear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Halpern said, his voice even but carrying through the room, "this wasn't a man eager to shoot. This was a husband faced with a choice in seconds. Stop a fleeing vehicle carrying armed assailants or let them disappear to hurt another family. He chose to stop them, decisively, lawfully, and without firing a single round at a human being." The jury watched the video again, some leaning forward in their seats. For the first time, I noticed a few nods, small, almost reluctant, but there. What we didn't expect was the new witness the DA called that afternoon: Troy Henson, the bearded man who had shoved Sarah. He took the stand in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed. His testimony was clipped, resentful. He admitted to impersonating an HOA enforcer, but claimed the idea wasn't his. Said he and Cal were working a job for someone who'd promised them cash for intimidating a few homeowners. Halpern seized on that. "Who hired you, Mr. Henson?" Troy hesitated, shifting in the witness chair. "Guy named Kane. Richard Kane. Met him at a bar near Westridge. Said the lady in the blue house had been making trouble about community rules. Wanted us to scare her a little." A murmur rolled through the courtroom. I saw Sarah straighten slightly in her seat, her brows knitting at the name. I'd heard it before: Richard Kane, president of the nearby HOA. A man whose fondness for rules was second only to his fondness for throwing his weight around at meetings. Halpern glanced at the judge. "Permission to submit additional evidence," he said, producing printed text messages from Troy's confiscated phone. The messages were from a contact labeled RK, giving instructions on which houses to target, promising cash up front, and no police trouble. The DA's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly as the messages were entered into the record. The judge ordered a short recess while the DA's office conferred. Sarah's hand found mine during the break. Richard Kane, she whispered, shaking her head. I knew he had a mean streak, but this hiring thugs? I didn't answer. I was still trying to reconcile the face of the clean-cut HOA president with the man who had set this all in motion. When the session resumed, Kane himself had been summoned by subpoena. He strode in with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, dressed in a suit that seemed just a little too sharp for the occasion. Under oath, he denied everything, claimed the texts were fabricated, said he'd never seen Troy or Cal before. But his voice cracked slightly under Halpern's cross-examination, especially when confronted with a bank record showing a cash withdrawal matching the amount Troy had described. The tension in the courtroom shifted like the tide. Kane's composure faltered further when the detective testified about security footage from the bar, grainy but clear enough to show Kane sliding an envelope across the table to Troy, a flash of his cufflinks glinting under the dim light. By the time Kane stepped down, his denial sounded hollow, even to himself. 2 days later, the jury returned. The DA's office formally dropped any charges against me, acknowledging my actions as justified under the Castle Doctrine. Troy and Cal were convicted of aggravated assault, attempted robbery, and impersonating an officer. Kane was indicted on conspiracy to commit assault and solicitation of criminal mischief, charges that carried their own heavy weight. When the verdict was read, I didn't feel triumph, just a deep, bone-weary relief. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening not with victory, but with the fragile peace of knowing the worst was behind us. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, microphones shoved forward with questions I didn't want to answer. Halpern guided us through the crowd, with the steady efficiency of a man who'd done it all before. When we finally reached the truck, Sarah exhaled a long breath and leaned her head back against the seat. It's over, she said softly. I nodded, though part of me knew that recovery from broken ribs, from the fracture of trust in the safety of our own street, would take more than a verdict. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels earned. But every evening as the sun dipped low over the cul-de-sac, I found myself glancing toward the porch where the rifle had once rested, reminded that peace is something you keep watch over. The weeks after the verdict felt like stepping into a different season, not because the weather had changed, but because the house itself finally exhaled. The sirens were gone, the court dates behind us, yet the silence carried its own kind of weight. Sarah came home from the hospital in late spring sunlight, moving slowly, her ribs still strapped beneath her blouse. Every step up the porch made her wince, but she waved off my offer to carry her bag. Not broken everywhere, she said with a small smile, though I could see the effort it cost her. Recovery became our new routine. I set alarms to remind her of the pain meds, learned the gentle art of arranging pillows just right so she could sleep without the sharp pull in her side. She teased me sometimes, called me her overqualified nurse, but the truth was I didn't mind hovering. It was the first time in years I felt like all my training, all the discipline I'd carried home from the Navy, had a quiet purpose. Nights were the hardest. She'd wake with a stiff breath or a sharp gasp when she shifted too quickly, and I'd be there, steadying her with a palm against her back, whispering that she was safe. Some nights it was me who stayed awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, watching the dark shape of the porch through the blinds. I never saw the Malibu again, but sometimes I thought I heard its low idle in the distance, like a ghost sound stitched into memory. A month after the sentencing, when Sarah could finally walk around the house without wincing, I decided it was time to fix something I hadn't realized was broken, the space above the gun safe on the porch. I sanded down a small wooden board, carved into it with a steady hand, the letters rough but deliberate. This home is protected by righteous fury. When I mounted it above the safe, Sarah leaned against the doorframe, her arms folded gently across her healing ribs. The evening light caught the edges of the carving, throwing long, warm shadows across the porch. She smiled, soft, a little tired, but full of that quiet strength that had carried us through everything. It's not about anger, she said, brushing a fingertip across the carved letters. I nodded. It's about knowing where the line is, and never letting anyone cross it again. That sign became more than wood and words. It was a reminder, not of the fight, but of why we fought. Our home, our peace, each other. Neighbors still passed by with guarded smiles. Some stopped to chat. A few even brought over pie or offered to mow the lawn as Sarah healed. Others still crossed to the opposite sidewalk. I didn't hold it against them. People fear what they don't understand. By midsummer, Sarah could laugh without flinching, could lift the grocery bags again, though I still tried to take them from her when I could. We hosted a small cookout for a few friends and neighbors. The air smelled of grilled corn and charcoal, a scent that finally felt like normalcy returning. But even in the calm, I kept certain habits. The M4 stayed locked in its place, the key to the safe always within reach. Not because I expected trouble, because I understood that peace isn't something you assume. It's something you keep watch over. On the last evening of August, we sat on the porch together, the sun dipping low over the cul-de-sac, kids' laughter echoing faintly from 2 houses down. Sarah rested her head on my shoulder, her breathing steady, no longer guarded. For the first time in months, the sound of the wind through the trees felt like just wind, not a warning. I thought about the first rule I'd learned on deployment: trust your point man's instincts. At home, Sarah had been my point man that morning. I'd ignored her gut feeling, and we'd both paid for it. That lesson stayed with me, not as guilt, but as a vow. I'd never overlook her instincts again. As dusk deepened, the carved sign above the safe caught the last stripe of gold from the setting sun. The words glowed for a brief moment before the light faded, leaving only the outline against the wood. That's when I realized we hadn't just survived that day. We'd built something sturdier in its aftermath, a home that understood the weight of both steel and love, and how each could protect the other. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video. It really helps us share more stories like this. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what the weather's like there today. And if you know someone who'd enjoy this story, go ahead and share it with them.